Okay, let's make a start, I think. And good morning, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your evenings, whatever you got up to. Um, Yesterday we talked about the technical challenges and the legislative requirements that are going to be coming in India in the next couple of years. Today we're going to talk about an industry that's going to arise virtually because of those legislative requirements and the technical requirements, and that's AdBlue. Now, we've seen in many other countries over the world, Brazil, China, not least the US and the EU as well, that this has actually posed a huge opportunity for people like yourselves to come into a new business that has exponential growth potential. But with that as well, there's significant challenges that come along with it. Logistical, quality, pricing has always been an issue in all of those markets as well. So we're going to look at all those issues today. We've got some interesting people that are speaking. We've got a great panel coming up later as well. And I'm going to start by giving you an introduction to how we see the Indian market developing over the next couple of years, and also some of the challenges you should expect given what we've seen in other markets. So this is the slightly cumbersome title, Indian AdBlue Market Update and Experience from Established Markets. And really, if any of you saw my presentation yesterday, you'll see that there was legislation and some bits and pieces about truck sales. So I won't dwell on those for too long, but we'll go over the timeline for legislation again quickly. The main OEM after treatment strategies, our AdBlue consumption methodology, what we expect from SCR truck sales, and then our AdBlue consumption forecast for the years ahead. And then really, I think which is potentially a slightly more interesting area is looking at the supply side of the market and thinking about what could happen in terms of challenges. We know that from other markets that cheating is always a problem in any market, both in terms of the urea used, the quality of the AdBlue product, but also from the driver's side in terms of using emulators. That will happen here. I'm sorry to say, in some capacity. It's just a case of how much it happens. It's happening in the EU, it's happening to some extent in the US, it's certainly happening in Brazil, China. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the evolution of the AdBlue supply chain. Things tend to move in a certain structure. We're seeing similar experience in China now to what happened in Europe in the early days. And also just a urea supply and demand balance globally to see where, as we all know, India doesn't have urea for industrial purposes particularly, and you'll need to source that urea from elsewhere. We'll give you some ideas as to where you may be able to get that from and the current state of play in urea for automotive grade purposes. In terms of demand, the flow diagram you have in front of you is our typical AdBlue demand consumption methodology. We use this in most of our reports for Europe, the US, China, all over the world. And effectively, it starts with truck and bus sales. So in most markets, the market begins with trucks and then moves on to other vehicle categories. And in India, for the time being, we see trucks being the main source of demand. And then we take from that, we strip out all the alternative fuels, all the alternative technologies, and we get to diesel vehicle sales. Then the legislation aspect kicks in, and we say, okay, when will legislation come online? And we now know that in most cases, the SCR is the predominant technology in terms of meeting Euro 6 equivalent type legislation. So we say, okay, when will the legislation come online? That would dictate when the technology comes into the market, and you start seeing SCR vehicle sales. When you start seeing SCR vehicle sales, then you start to see the replacement of older vehicles, and then you see the growing of an SCR fleet. And then we get into the AdBlue part. So once you have the vehicles on the road, and you know how many of them there are, then you have to look at the AdBlue dosing rates, which takes you back to the OEM strategies in terms of how they expect the vehicle to behave in order to meet the emissions standards. So you may have dosing rates of 2%, you may have dosing rates up to 6% in certain circumstances. The average for Euro 6 equivalent is around 3 or 4%. We look at distance travelled, so the amount of miles the truck is doing, the fuel economy of the trucks, and all of that gives you your AdBlue requirement. And then finally, we have the adjustment for the informal market. So that, as I said, there will be cheating. That's in a country such as India or any other, really, frankly, the enforcement can only go so far, and we always make an adjustment for what we see the level of that cheating in the market. So in Europe, that's around 5 to 10%, depending on the country. In China, it's 50%. In Brazil, it's around 35%. So just give you an idea of the scale of some of the informal market. And like I said, that takes either the form of urea solution production from fertilizer grade urea, or from drivers using emulators to just turn off the SCR system altogether. So I showed this yesterday, but just to bear in mind, as you're all aware, Euro 6 is when the market will kick in. We'll take the questions at the end of this. Euro 6 is Barrett 6 will come in April 2020, and that's when we expect to see the market taking off nationwide. Just to give you, this is again taken from my presentation yesterday on the truck market, but we in the truck market, Tata Motors and Ashok Leyland are the biggest producers by far, and in the bus market, it's the same two companies. And I've just given an overview of their NOx reduction strategies for Barrett 6. In both cases, it's an SCR plus EGR configuration for the after-treatment system, which means that really, like I said, SCR is the predominant technology in order to meet Euro 6 or Barrett 6 equivalent legislation, and in this case they're keeping some element of EGR in, probably to keep the dosing rates down. So you would expect a slightly lower dosing rate than you'd see maybe in Europe or North America, where most of the systems are now SCR only. Back to that is effectively the whole market for trucks and buses past period. In terms of the fleet forecast, I've added in another year there just to give you an idea of the growth. So as older vehicles are retired, SCR vehicles come into the market. So again, in 2016, the numbers are fairly minuscule. In 2020, that block there is virtually just all the new sales, and then it grows each year with every new block of sales that comes on. So for every year, every new truck that comes in adds to the fleet. None of the SCR fleet has been retired yet, because they'll be retired after 10, 15, 20 years, and every year then the SCR fleet grows. So you by 2027 you're looking at a fleet of around 500,000 units, and that will grow every year for 20 years effectively, until all the old trucks are replaced. Going back to that slide, you're looking at 2 billion litres in over a 10-year period. That's basically the key takeaway from this portion. And 700,000 tonnes of urea needed. Speaking to some of you yesterday, a lot of the questions I was being asked, where is that urea going to come from, and how is the market going to develop in terms of supply infrastructure and so on. So I thought it would be useful to share this with you. This is our typical AdBlue supply chain overview. And this could be applied to virtually any market where you have automotive grade solution being produced from urea. And so the whole building block of the industry really is urea production and supply. Now clearly in India there is urea production, but none of it's going to go to this use. So that is all going to have to come from imports. Then you have what's called integrated and non-integrated production. Again, in India, the integrated production is where you have urea coming directly from the melt into AdBlue production. So that's not going to happen here. You'll have non-integrated AdBlue production. And then distribution, which we'll talk about a bit more in a minute. And then end-user sales. And so really from this flow diagram beneath, you'll skip out the domestic urea production and prilling aspect and just go straight to urea imports to dissolving, and then from dissolving to packaging and AdBlue distribution. In the early stages of any market, what you tend to see is packaged goods first, because they require the lowest capital investment, and then you move into bulk supply, and then from there a pump infrastructure is built up at fuel retailers. First of all, the storage will be above ground, and then the storage will move below ground, and then you move into a much more bulk But the point is that to get from each one of those stages, it takes significant investment in either logistics from the AdBlue supplier point of view or an AdBlue distributor point of view, investment in stainless steel tanks, investment in the road haulage, investment from the fuel retailer in the pump network and the storage as well, and also the investment in manufacturing facilities. So in India, it's going to be all non-integrated manufacturing facilities. So that's storage tanks and blending tanks all over the country in order to make this viable. So, like I said, you move from a high-cost, low-capital product in the first instance, and as you move down that line, the volumes get bigger, but the investment gets bigger, and the price comes down as well. The cost comes down. I'll come back to that in a minute as well. But the other point that people were asking about yesterday was urea. Now, like I said, you're going to have to buy your urea from abroad here, and people were worrying about the availability of technical or automotive grade urea in India. Personally, and as an organisation, we don't see it as a problem. There is significant capacity of this grade urea in the world. There's multiple channels where you can be buying it from. I'll talk you through these graphs in a minute, but there's significant capacity of this material from China. They've got excess supply. They could easily provide into India. Saudi Arabia, Russia, Indonesia has some supply as well. So there is an absolute availability of this material. So I really don't see that urea supply would be a problem. Urea quality in the initial stages of the market may be an issue, because until you get to know your suppliers well, and industry can certainly help you with that, but until you get to know your suppliers well and know where to buy from reputable sources, you may have some issues with bags of urea that say automotive grade, but have been blended with material that's bound for the fertilizer market as well. So you need to really know your sources. But like I said, if you want to speak to me with them, we know these people and we can help you with that. Just to talk you through these two charts, just to prove this point, these are from our automotive grade urea report that we produce every quarter that tracks this market. And we go through plant by plant on the supply side, covering all the countries that produce automotive grade urea, so all the plants in Europe, all the plants in North America, China, Asia Pacific, Latin America, Russia, and the Middle East, North Africa. I would say, okay, how much of their allocation of urea supply is going to this market? That's on the supply side. And then how much is their market taking out of that? That's on the demand side. So, walking you through that, Europe is the biggest market at the moment, and also is fully self-sufficient. And then, with some exceptions, the UK being one. In fact, we buy some material from China and Russia. Then North America is the second biggest market, and you see the movement from Europe to North America. That's effectively Yara's exports of 50% solution across the Atlantic. China, you see, is a big exporter, a big producer and exporter. Its major markets being North America, Asia Pacific, and so on. And as you go down, it becomes slightly more difficult to read that off. But Latin America is a big market. They have some of their own production, but a lot of the material comes from China, also comes from the US and from the EU by Yara. Russia doesn't really have a market, even though they have legislation, it's not enforced. So they sell quite a lot of material into the EU, mainly to the UK. And then the Middle East and North Africa, they export virtually all their material. That's largely SABIC in Saudi Arabia selling material across the Atlantic and also into the EU. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the urea business for automotive grade urea. The chart on the other side of the slide is trade. So that just breaks out, takes away all the domestic production, and you see slightly more clearer the trade. So you see that China is the biggest trader, shipping majority of its product to North America and to Asia Pacific, also to Latin America, and to some extent to the EU. And then the EU shipping material to North America, Latin America, that's all Yara. And then Russia exporting to Latin America and the EU, and so on. Just talk you through the trade flows that I've discussed there. So basically the point of this is that the urea supply is not going to be a problem once you know who to source from. That's our view for certain. Where there are likely to be issues, and this is the experience from other markets, is that if you can get in the urea in adequate quality, what in the initial stages may be an issue. We've seen that elsewhere, but again, I think that can be overcome quite quickly. Where the real money needs to be spent is on the development of a logistics infrastructure. This is moving from stage 1 to stage 2 and into stage 3. So buying stainless steel tanks for the back of your tractors, for your trucks, for moving bulk material. You're going to have to move into bulk transportation in order to keep the cost low enough to make the industry viable at bulk volume. Otherwise, people just start cheating if the cost of the AdBlue is too high. The development of a supply infrastructure, the retail pump network, that's, like I said, that's expensive for few retailers, and they need to be sure that the volumes they're going to sell are going to give them a payback period that they can live with. What we've seen in other parts of the world is an influx of new entrants into the market and heightened price competition. No one likes to hear this, but this is what happens. There's relatively few barriers to entry in the initial stages of the market for AdBlue. Storage and blending is not particularly expensive to put in. Maintaining customer base later on is more difficult once quality becomes more important. But you will see increased price competition once the market starts to really take off in the years between 2020 and 2025. People will come into the market and it will get more competitive. That's happened everywhere. The other issue, as I've mentioned before, is the abundance of unlicensed and substandard urea solution that you're likely to see come into the market. Again, it's difficult to avoid this. It happens all over the world. Someone somewhere will buy fertilizer grade urea and blend it with contaminated water, and you will have deficient product on the market. As people that take care of the quality and that side of things, who want to do things in a reputable fashion, I think really the key thing here is to educate your buyers that quality matters. It matters for the asset that they have, which is their vehicle, and that using substandard material will eventually damage the vehicle and they'll be out of pocket in the long run. So that's essential from your point of view. But in China we have 10 major producers now really, and 500 or 600 producers producing in their backyards, a lot of which is substandard material. But that will at some point clear itself out, because people will start to see problems with their vehicles as a result of using that material. And like I said, the best thing you can do is just stick to producing high quality material and educating your users. And the final issue that again we have it in Europe, and you definitely have it in Brazil and in China, is the use of emulators by drivers. This is particularly an issue in countries where you have a truck market like you have in India, I'm afraid to say, which is a large number of owner-operators, small fleets. They tend to be more inclined to take the risk to cheat, because they don't have corporate responsibility issues that bigger fleets have, and so on. Now, I know a lot of that sounds quite negative, but really it's not. It's just growing pains of an industry that is about to take off in a big way in this country. So you can't expect to have all that growth without some issues. And these are just things to be aware of. But this has happened elsewhere, and I'd bet money on these things happening here. In terms of conclusions, this is just really repeating what I've said already, but the AdBlue market is set to take off in earnest post-2020 as the SCR fleet grows. Typically, the AdBlue market matures over 20 years. We were hearing yesterday that the replacement cycle for a truck in India is around 20 years. That seems relatively high for me, but in any case, let's take that as a standard, and that means that the market will be mature in 20 years. That gives you 20 years of growth. So it's well worth making those investments. Indian demand will reach 2 billion litres by 2027. That's bearing in mind that the legislation comes on in 2020, but that's where we stand. That's an equivalent to the EU in 2015. Urea supply will not be an issue in our view. Like I said, logistics development for bulk delivery and a pump infrastructure will be the bigger issues. But again, they've been overcome in other markets. They just need the willing of the market and significant financial investment. And in terms of cheating, it's going to happen, but your role really, in order to maintain your businesses and to have productive businesses, is to educate your customers and to try and educate the market as well, in terms of using viable product in the long term. So that's all I have to say as an introduction to the topic today. I'm happy to take any questions at this point, if anybody has any. You had one before, yeah. Have we got a microphone?
Hi there.
Hi.
Can you just elaborate on what do you mean by cheating in the AdBlue market?
Yeah, it takes two forms, effectively. One is from the supplier side, which is using urea that's not of a significant quality, sufficient quality to make AdBlue, or the ISO standard solution. And the other is on the driver side, which is the use of emulators to turn off the SCR system or to lower the dosage rate. There's two forms, I'm afraid.
But I guess when you